Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining and for your time. We're excited to get started. We have quite a few registrations joining in, but this is a popular topic. We're excited to talk about doing big things with a small team, automation tips and tricks. And obviously, it's popular for a number of different reasons. How do we get started? And hey, maybe you're an old-time pro and you've been doing this for a while, and sometimes you're just considering, hey, I've got this use case I got to do. So we're going to talk through a number of different ways that we use it here internally with Ryan and Noah. A couple things with order of business. We will please put your questions that you have throughout the webinar in the chat function and the question function here in the GoToWebinar panel that you joined. We will cover those questions during our Q&A at the end of the webinar. So we'll have a time set aside for those questions. With that, let's go ahead and introduce our panel. We have Ryan Bacon and Noah Rosen. Ryan, would you like to start?
First, unmute myself. My name is Ryan Bacon. I am the IT support manager here at JumpCloud. I've been doing IT work for about 8 or 9 years now and started really getting into the automation side of things probably about 5 or 6 years ago.
Great. And Noah?
Hey everyone, my name is Noah Rosen. I am a senior IT support specialist here at JumpCloud. I have been at JumpCloud for about 2 years, which is also the extent of my IT career so far. I currently focus very heavily on the automation side of things and building out tools for our department to use and be more efficient.
Great. Thanks, guys. And my name's Tim Wharton. I'm an MSP partner manager here, and I'll be your host for today. Let's jump into the agenda. What are we going to be covering today? So first, we're going to go with where to start. How do you start with automation? When to start automating? Automation and scalability as you get to larger and larger numbers, what does that look like? And automation and security, how do we do this securely? And then we'll end up with our Q&A session. So with that, without further ado, I will turn it over to Ryan and Noah, who will start with today's topic. So thank you. Ryan?
All right, well, I'll kick it off on the first couple slides. So we're just going to dive right into it. With automation, you have to decide what processes are important to automate and where should you start implementing automation. What you want to choose is a process that, first of all, is something that can be automated. You know, there's some tasks that are not repetitive enough that or require too much human interaction to make it worth spending your time automating. And you also want to have a process that's automated, or you want to choose a process to be automated that might expand in the future. That way, as this process becomes more complicated and as more steps are added and more complexity is added as an organization grows, you want to be able to expand that automation. If you're automating tons and tons of simple, small tasks, but to even kick off that automation takes some type of interaction, at that point, you're not even automating anything because you're having to go through and kick off 30 scripts for each individual task. So you want to have some large process that can be automated and expanded. The automation can be built on to increase the scope of that specific automation tool. The main example we're going to be covering today is new employee onboarding. It's a process that all companies deal with, especially in our industry, as tech startups and tech companies in general are experiencing massively rapid growth right now. And this growth is no longer isolated to local environments like an office. You might be growing a remote workforce, in which case more and more of this onboarding process is going to be done over the internet and using tools as opposed to sitting down next to someone and talking them through configuration and setup of their system. And you may have less time to put hands on their system or on their user accounts if you're not going to be in a same physical office with them. You also have to figure out, is there a better way? Is there a path to automation for each of your processes that improves upon the time investment required versus doing these same steps manually? I think we can go to the next slide. So it's a simple math equation. you need to know whether the time it will take to create this automation tooling or implement automation. I apologize if you're squeaking in the background. My dog got a new squeaky toy this morning and he's very excited about it. So you have to decide if the time it will take to automate a process is worth the time investment to develop that automation. Building automation tooling, especially from scratch, can be a large time investment. If a process is not taking a lot of effort, brain power or time per cycle, whatever cycle you use in your department, then it might not be worth automating that process. For example, if something takes one person 30 seconds a month to do, and it'll take 5 people a month to write the code to automate that specific step because of the complexity, obviously it's not worth doing that step, or it's not worth automating that process. Another reason to move towards automation is improving the accuracy, consistency, and security of a process. Anytime you have humans interacting with any process, obviously you leave a hole where human error can cause issues. So if that process can be done in an automated fashion, in a more consistent fashion than what a human could do, that's another good reason to automate, even if there isn't necessarily a huge time savings benefit for security processes, things like logging, providing access requests, stuff where there may be room for human error. If you can take that out through automation, that's a great process to decide to automate.
All right, and I will take it from here. And another real big advantage of automation and using it for your process is scalability. With a growing company, with a growing user base, more, having to support more people, more applications, everything like that, automation is what's going to save you time. And so you have to look at, you need to be able to perform these tasks in a way that does not scale linearly. So, if you do a 1 minute task once per week per user for 20 users, that's going to be, you're using the same amount of time per unit. If you're doing it manually, it's going to grow. When you get up to 500 users, it's going to you're going to be using that 500 minutes, or sorry if my math is failing me right now, but it's you can't, linear growth is not really scalable. So you want to, if you have a task with automation that uses about the same amount of effort for 20 users as it does for 500 users, just going and clicking a button, letting this process run while you go off and do other things, that is a much more scalable option. And that's really what your goal is. That's your force multiplier. And even if it takes you, a month worth of time to build out this tooling, to build out a script, in the long run, the amount of time saved by you, for you and your team will more than make up for the amount of effort put into creating the tooling. And the thing is that, when you're looking at a growing organization, a growing workload for an IT department, it's not always a viable option, whether through budgetary restraints or, any number of things. It's not always a viable option to just add people to the team. And honestly, even if you had all the money in the world, it's not, it gets to a point where it's not the most efficient thing. It's not the smartest move. It's kind of like a brute force method. So if you want to, be more efficient, be more, more adept at your skill set and what you're offering, and frankly, make yourself look good, because, to outside, to other members of the organization, automation is like magic, so, it's a force multiplier. So automating as many workflows as you can is what will allow you to do more with less, or more with the same number of people that you have. So let's talk about security. So as Noah mentioned in the previous slides, there's, one of the biggest security issues with workflows is human error. And, if you are doing everything manually, especially if you're getting really busy, you have a lot on your plate, it's easy to either cut corners or simply, miss something, forget something. So the less that a person has to touch a process, the more secure it is, because it's consistent. It's it's a program doing it. It's a recipe, so it's doing the same thing over and over again, and human error is taken out of it. So that in and of itself improves security. And also you can better obfuscate a process. So somebody if you're working from a coffee shop or something like that, and there's a shoulder surfer or whatever, and they just see you execute a script, that's going to be a lot more secure than them than them seeing you go and like create a user and assign to user groups and actually see like the actual structure and processes that you're going through for provisioning someone or pulling logs or whatever. So it's and so it provides that level of security, because you're not exposing the process to the really to the outside world. It's all happening under the hood. And a very important thing, and if you're in a company that has to go through any kind of audits, whether it's PCI or SOC or anything like that, having an automation, and whether you could have your automation generate logs to show auditors, or really being able to show the tooling, the script, the processes used, whether it is a script or using off-the-shelf products to create automated workflows. You can point out every single step and say, this is what we're doing, here 1 2 3 4, and we have it going through this process that is not prone to human error. It's a much better control, and therefore it makes it a much easier to audit and looks better to auditors. All right, now I'm going to hand this off to you.
Sorry about that. Struggling with the mute.
Sorry, I caught Noah off guard. We had split off these scripts, and I jumped ahead. So this is still me. So I'm sorry about that. So what are some of the automation, common automation tools? So a lot of times, I know, especially for me, when I first started, getting into automation and stuff like that, I always thought scripting. So Bash, PowerShell, Python, everything like that. That's what I thought of with automation. But it's more than just that. There are there are products out there that provide automation features and workflows and everything like that. And also your different applications or tools that you already use may not seem like they provide automation, but in a way that they do. So like looking at directories, whether it's Active Directory or JumpCloud or any of a number of them, in the directory, you can assign, different permissions and different, restrictions and resources to user groups. So instead of having to have a user be assigned individually to the various resources, you add them to the group, and then at that point they're added to all those resources. That is a basic form of automation. Anything that you set up ahead of time, anything that you do that reduces the number of human touches, is a form of automation. So directories, are becoming a much bigger part of your toolkit to streamline and create these workflows. So, and as I mentioned, there are the various scripting languages, and really it doesn't have to be just scripting languages. You could go on with, full-blown, compiled code if you really want to. But, for most of us IT people and most of the work that we do, a script is more than enough. And kind of tying into the directories are policies. So whether they be GPOs or, MDM, mobile configs, anything like that, you can, use these to create system settings, create, set your firewall, everything like that. And again, these are usually tied to either system groups or user groups or, stuff like that within a directory of some sort, so that those two are working together to standardize your environment. And again, where you're not having to go to each system and, set these things manually. It's all happening automatically. Another thing that I really didn't think of, that I didn't really consider until I came to JumpCloud and became a really heavy Slack user, is leveraging things like auto replies. So like if you're in Slack or, other tools like Slack, you can use, like Slack's Slackbot, where if it detects a certain phrase or something like that, it will automatically reply with a response. So we do that to where, if somebody like a VPN configuration or something like that, or print settings, if somebody's going into the office and wants to print, luckily we don't have many printers in our office, so it's not a common thing, but still it came up enough times to spend 5 minutes to set this up, where, in our Slack, you can put in like !print, and it will give you the instructions for each office and how to set up the printers. So it's, those common things. And the next step from that is a lot of help desks now, and a lot of help desk platforms will have these automatic answer features, where it will either automatically reply to a request or maybe suggest solutions when somebody, when it detects certain phrases or anything like that. So it's a good idea to look at your help desk software to see if it supports that sort of functionality and leverage that, because that's also a force multiplier. If you look at all the common questions, all the questions that you get that pop up every single day, and if you can answer those with a click of the button, or even less than a click of a button, then that's going to free up your time for you and your team to work on other more pressing matters. And then of course with email, with emails, you can set up filters for auto replies and that sort of thing. You can even get various applications and plugins, whether it's through your help desk or other software, to generate automatic replies, or even if it's like an alert, where if something, if one of your applications that your user base is uses on a regular basis, it is an important business function, you can, there are ways to set up alerts where it will send like a blast out to your employee base saying, hey, this is experiencing degradation or whatever, and it really will vary based on the tools, and we'll get to some of those, but there are tools that allow you to do that sort of thing. So one thing that we're going to cover, the one language that we're going to talk about a lot is PowerShell, because that's what we leverage a lot of. I mean, we do we do use some other, we do dabble in other languages, but PowerShell is probably our biggest, because of the fact that with, obviously we use JumpCloud as our directory, and our solutions architecture team has built a PowerShell module to wrap around the JumpCloud API. So, I'm more familiar with PowerShell than other scripting languages, that's what I used when I started the creating scripts and automation here at JumpCloud. So as Noah mentioned, our big our pride and joy that we use all the time is a script that we use for onboarding. How this started was me just dabbling in it, and I created processes, and really I used it about half the time, when onboarding new users, because it was still, when I originally created it, it was still faster to do one person manually, because I didn't have that much functionality built into the script. But as I added to it, it added the different features into the script, expanded the capabilities of it. It became more efficient for me to run the script even on a single person, and that's really where you want to get to when building out these tools, where you're saving time on one person, and you're which means you're saving time when you're having to onboard 20 new employees or 30 new employees, anything like that. But with the script, the general idea is we have a spreadsheet that we fill out that has the employees' information, name, start date, role, even the OS preference for their workstation. And what the script does is we run it, and it will go through, it will create the identities, it assigns them to user groups, which gives them access to resources, which then it binds them to their system, everything that we need to do. And it's also, logs are getting created as we go. And also for, going back to the auditing thing, what it does is, as part of our auditing process, is we submit access requests to our security team saying, this person's going to need access to these special resources, and then it gets approval and everything from there. Or there's some tools like our Salesforce. We have a team of Salesforce admins. So we don't, like, IT does not do anything with Salesforce. So we have, the script, and sends a request to Slack to the Salesforce admin saying, hey, this person needs a Salesforce account. So that was, I will fully admit, that was one of those things when we were doing it manually, that that's what generally fell through the cracks or was done at the last minute. So now that it's in the script and being automated, it's being done early on, and so that those admins have plenty of time to get it set up, so when the new employee starts, they have what they need on day one. And again, all of this is being done with, well, maybe not the push of a button, it's a push of a metaphorical button. It's just executing a single command. And so more examples of automation. So as I mentioned, group policies that assign permissions based on roles, and system settings, everything like that. The new hire scripts. You could have a tool or script, a process that runs on a scheduled basis, a scheduled task that goes out and checks for certain conditions or parameters on a group of users or a group of systems. And if it sees something, it will take an action. And this will free up time to doing manual audits. And then, as I mentioned, a chat auto response to respond to common questions. I'm going to hand it off to Noah now to talk a bit more about our onboarding script.
Yeah, so as Ryan mentioned before, our specific implementation in this script that we run for onboarding is done in PowerShell, but this is entirely language and platform agnostic. The workflow of this process or any process, and obviously feel free to copy our process exactly or use it as an idea for a framework of a general direction of how you could handle this type of automation. This could be done in Bash, you could do this in Python, you could basically do this in any language. Depending on what type of central identity you're using to basically define the user's roles and like the state, like credentials, you might be able to interact with that specific or that directory using, in our case, the JumpCloud PowerShell module, which is really just an API wrapper. As far as I know, every single directory service out there has some method of interaction via an SDK, API, whatever. So as long as you have some way to interact with the central directory, this specific workflow of having a user defined in a single place, their identity is being defined in a single directory, and then that directory acts as the central point where all the other resources are handed out either through that directory or at least using that centralized directory as a reference for what type of access and credentials that user might need. So as Ryan mentioned before, in our specific implementation, with the input of the new hire's name, department, role, team, start date, and system serial number. So that's going to be the initial input for a new hire. And obviously this could be expanded to someone changing a role. You could have this you could have it check for changes from the last time the script was run or the last time this user's directory information was changed and log those changes. However you want to handle this for onboarding, changing roles, even offboarding, you could do the same process in reverse. So with the central identity, in our case, JumpCloud, obviously this is expandable to any other directory service. We're creating a user. The central identity for that user is stored in JumpCloud. This is where we would define a username, depending on how you handle password management, whether you use temporary default passwords or whether you have users create passwords via like an email. Obviously, this is going to depend heavily on if your environment is local or remote. Everyone has a different way of handling that. And it's also going to define a user's email address, which almost every service out there will use an email address as the identifier for each user. So this user now exists in our directory, JumpCloud, or whatever directory service you're using. And this is going to be defined, this user information right here is going to be defined by the user's name, and that'll determine username and email address. Next, once you have this user, it's going to be assigning this user to directory groups or permissions groups or whatever naming scheme that your directory is using. This user is going to be assigned to these groups based on what department, role, or team they're in. Say you have someone who's going to be working on the QA team. They might be given access to specific testing environments that someone on the DevOps team might not need access to. DevOps teams might be given access to production VPNs or production environments that the average software engineer doesn't have access to. This can all be controlled through directory groups, and this directory group based on this. Based on the input of department and role, the script can redirect which permissions groups users get put into based on that initial input. These directory groups can define basically anything. In our specific environment, we use them to define application access. Someone in finance might get access to Excel or Office 365 in general, as where someone in engineering would get access to GitHub or AWS. This would also define, in our case, access to a wireless network at a local office. Our wireless networks are authorized using radio servers, and since JumpCloud is acting as the authority of our radio servers, we can provision Wi-Fi access through directory groups, and we could even split off access to different wireless networks or different LANs based on which directory that user is assigned to. And this can also be used to provision VPN access. Bunch of different ways to do that, but you can define specific VPNs access to specific VPNs are only granted to users in specific directory groups, which again, those directory groups are assigned back here where it says department role. So this can all, again, this is all automated provisioning. So you're not manually creating certs or providing credentials to users. All of this is going to be tied to their identity in your central directory. And then we go through the next step of assigning the user to email groups. In our particular case, we use Gmail or Google Workspace. Most organizations these days do. If your organization is anything like ours, you probably have hundreds and hundreds of distribution groups. And this is one of those specific cases where it's really hard to know which user is supposed to go in which group, especially when you have 40 different potential roles in your organization. So back to before, the issue of consistency and removing human error. If all of this is documented and users are put in consistent groups, as opposed to having an IT team member trying to remember, or after the fact, managers and users contact the IT department saying, hey, can I be a part of this distribution group? And doing that 30 times for each user, huge time sink and also very inconvenient for the buyers. So if all of this can be done based on an initial input, then you cut out a lot of steps right there. Next thing we're going to be doing is binding a user to a workstation. Our end users, the end system that a user is using is managed by the JumpCloud user agent, which is a small little piece of software installed on those systems that apply policies. The important bit that we need to know is whether the user wants to have a Mac, Windows, or Linux system. So once we have that information, we can pull out a physical system for them, install the agent on it, and then during the input portion, we can put in the system serial number. This system doesn't have to be imaged for that specific user. It just has to be, or it just has to exist in JumpCloud with our agent running on it. Based on this serial number that you put in as the input, it'll bind that user's user account to that system. Once the user is bound to that system, you can reference the directory groups that that user is added to apply specific policies to that system. Maybe administrator or maybe software developers who are going to be running virtual machines and whatnot and interacting with the terminal are going to need to have root, sudo, admin access, whatever you want to call it, to those workstations, as where someone who's working in a sales role might not necessarily have a reason to have administrator access to their system. So those directory groups would not be assigning administrator policies to those workstations. At this step, also, we automatically rename the host, or we automatically set the host name of each workstation to match a format based on the user's username. This allows us to identify the system in our managed browser or in our antivirus software sensors. We can, instead of having to query systems by serial numbers, we can just look at host names, which are in third-party directories, and this is all done based on a standardized format. So now these systems themselves have a user bound to them, and they're configured to that user's permission set. So I kind of jumped ahead a little bit here, but the system's permissions are actually handled in our specific scenario by directory groups, which again are defined based on this information, the department and role information assigned to that individual user. So our script will say, hey, the user bound to the system belongs in the engineering department. So this system is going to be put into the system group that matches engineering. And based on these groups, we can install software via VPP for Apple, or the package manager we use for Windows is Chocolatey. For Linux, if you did this via JumpCloud's command runner or any automated remote way to run shell scripts on a remote Linux system, you could do this just through apt. And then we're also going to be applying policies. Like I said before, administrator policies, MDM policies. This could be screen lockout. This could be password change requirement policies. Million different ways you could go with this. And you can tailor the policies. You know, on Mac, you have MDM profile configuration. On Windows, you can do this through the registry. Literally an infinite number of ways you can configure systems through policies. And again, in our specific environment, all of this is done completely automated based on the input up in the top left corner you see, which is department and role. And the very last step the script takes is going to submit a security access request. Before we hand any resources out to users, we need to have approval from our security team. This is for auditing purposes, as well as having an extra set of eyes on each new users or each permission set that's expanded for users, just so that if one person makes this decision, there's a potential for mistakes and granting more permissions than are needed for a specific role or a specific task. So this security access request is generated based on the user's name, what role they're going to be in, what date they're going to be starting at the company, and what type of access they're going to need for their role, or if we're changing access, why that access change is needed, why their permission set needs to change. So again, super simple we have a CSV file with the person's name, department, role, team, start date, serial number. It takes 30 seconds per user to fill out. Just send the script off, and it does all of these steps per user in something like 15 seconds per user. So it's a very, very quick process, as where if you could imagine doing each one of these steps by hand, in our specific case, it would take well over an hour per user, and now it takes about 15 seconds. So even though this development of the script took a long time, as our user base expands exponentially, we save exponentially more time, and this requires very little maintenance to maintain the organization of this workflow.
All right,
and I'm going
thanks.
to kick it back to Ryan. Yeah. Nope, that's I was just say kick it back to you.
All right. So the next example that we're going to give, we're going to move away from the onboarding, and this is going to be something showing you exact code. And I chose this because this is something that I had to do recently, and where, you know, if you've ever dealt with GitHub, you know, with managing their teams, especially through the web UI, you know that it can be very tedious. So for example, I was asked to create a team and give it read-only access to all of our repositories. And we have hundreds of repositories. And through the web UI, you could only add a repo to a team one at a time. And so I really didn't want to take the time to do that. I frankly didn't have the time to spend doing that manually. So it goes back to what was mentioned earlier, you know, asking yourself, is there a better way to do this? So yes, I can create a script, and this script, it's not very long, where we're pretty much, you know, you have to figure out what, you know, how I wanted to do this. So, you know, it pretty much all it does is it generates a list of all your repositories and assigns them to a variable, then feeds that variable into a loop, just saying for every repo in that list, do this API call. And I have, you can see that it has like the repo.name in there. That's stuff that I put in, you know, that I have the habit of doing, that shows like just some sort of output while the script is running, so I can tell like where it is in the process and that it's actually doing something and not hanging up. So, and this is also an example of an API call. A common API call is doing a curl, and you know, you would go and get the documentation on, you know, from whatever application you're using, and that, you know, the curl is a common way of interacting with APIs. So I spent about I didn't have a lot of experience with the GitHub API before this, so I spent about an hour, you know, going through their documentation, banging my head up against a wall every once in a while, but eventually I got it working. And so I spent an hour from start to finish on this, and that not only saved me several hours of doing this manually, but now that I have this script, I can repurpose it. So just with a few tweaks, I can, you know, give a team write access to every repo, or, you know, any kind of bulk action I have. Or if I want to, you know, do a set of teams, I can, you know, just tweak it a little bit where I put in a file input, or do a query with certain parameters to generate a list. So this is an example of just taking a little bit of time, taking some time to build a tool that will save you significant time in the long run. And, you know, again, be be a tool that you can repurpose. So, and this is just this is also an example of how you don't like if you're using PowerShell on a Mac. That's I use a Mac. Some of this is PowerShell, but PowerShell also will push shell commands directly on here. So that's what the curls are in there. So you can use the commandlets in PowerShell to do API calls, or web requests, that sort of thing. Or you can do curl, just push a curl command to the shell. Depending on the API, some prefer curls more than the PowerShell web requests. It really does vary, and that will take some experimentation. GitHub I found worked better with doing the curl command, and that worked out really well. It led itself to a pretty small script, and that's what it takes. And it's something that was kind of quick and dirty, but worked out very well. So going on to best practices, there are several things that, in my opinion, and that have helped me out a lot, and that I shared with Noah when he was learning, and he could chime in with his sort of things, with his thoughts on it. So when dealing with automation, no matter what language you are working in, most of them will support functions. So if there's something that you're going to be doing, like the one that we're showing here is how we generate a security request. So it actually, as it's running through the script, it will call this function, feed some variables into it based on, the role or whoever's doing it. And then it generates the URL, the URI that's used in the Slack API call that sends the request to the specific Slack channel. So we've used this in other scripts for email generation. So if you have, you could use a single function to send emails to multiple places, based on the variables that it's put in there. So, if you're going to be doing, the same thing multiple ways, this ends up saving a lot of space on the in the script. So instead of putting this block of code every place where it appears, where you have to do that, then it becomes just a line or line or two to call this function and feed it its variable. So it helps to create much cleaner code and much more consistent code. The next thing is input validation. So there are, input validation can happen on multiple levels. So like for us, for our onboarding spreadsheet, we use a Google sheet that we save as a CSV and feed it in. The sheet itself uses validation, whether it's through drop downs or it auto populates based on inputs, that sort of thing. That's one way of doing it. Another thing that you can do is in the code itself, look at the input that comes in there and like check to see if there's leading or trailing spaces that may throw things off, or remove, use a regular expression to remove special characters if the application doesn't support it, that sort of thing. Next will be error catching. So the second screenshot down here is a way of doing error catching. In PowerShell, a very simple way of doing that is going to be doing a try catch. So try running this command. If it fails, if it succeeds, continue on. If it fails, do this output. So, and in lieu of time, I could go on and on about all of these. But as we've mentioned, doing logging, working with APIs. The one thing that I wanted to point out is plotting things out. So when you are working on creating a script, going back to this is one of the ways that I plot things out. I think logically what we want to do and what's going to get done, and that will really help to determine how you want to construct your script. Noah, anything you want to add to this? Because we definitely want to leave time for questions.
Yeah, the last tiny thing I'll throw in with the best practices. As IT team members, as smart as all of us are, we are not all software developers. So you want to make sure that any scripting that you implement for any type of automation tooling that's going to be maintained for an IT department is human readable and expandable by team members who may not be, master software developers. Keeping things simple and developing scripting that is easy to go back to once everyone who developed that's no longer in a department. In 5 years from now, when your automated tooling breaks or there's a large change, you want to be able to have whoever comes in afterwards be able to read it and modify that and not have to start from scratch. So I would say, especially in an IT department, it's important to keep your automation scripting as simple as possible while still accomplishing everything you need it to do.
Now let Noah continue on with this.
Yeah, so last little bit, where can you learn about this? I'd say Microsoft's own documentation, if you want to dive into PowerShell, is a great place to start. They have hugely expansive documentation, and from there, they redirect you to other resources where you can take actual classes if you're completely new to any type of programming or scripting. Another great place to look is if you don't want to lock yourself into Microsoft's ecosystem, even though PowerShell obviously can run on Mac OS, Linux, Android, anything, is Bash. Bash is installed on basically everything in the world with a processor on it. So if you can write in Bash, you can pretty much automate across any environment without having to install a bunch of extra tools and maintain those tools. A Bash automation can be expanded across an entire fleet of basically anything that has a processor in it. I personally like this company, or learnshell.org. It's open source. They're totally free to use. They're a cool company. But there are literally millions of online resources for Bash. So just a quick Google search of jumping into Bash is another great place to start.
All right, time for questions.
Yeah, thanks guys. Thanks Ryan. No, that was great. We do have some great questions coming on in. Feel free to add some more as we go. Think through your own use cases, the problems and challenges that you're going through now. But let's start with the first question. Is there a way to generate a deactivated user report that can be sent via email to a select list?
So yes, it's going to depend on where you're pulling the deactivated users. So for example, if you're using JumpCloud and you are suspending users and putting users in a suspended state when you offboard them instead of fully deleting their accounts, you can use the PowerShell module to pull those lists into a pull the list of users in a suspended state into a variable, then do that one of those for each loops where it says for each user in deactivated users, then use the PowerShell's commands to create a CSV where it's just going through and generating the lines of the CSV for each person, and then doing an email function on there, which PowerShell has commandlets for email, and the Microsoft documents or Microsoft documentation is a great place to find those exact commands. but you can generate that, attach the CSV to the email, and then send it off to whoever you need to. It's very, really the process is very similar no matter where you're going for. It's just the exact details of how you do it. So if you're doing pulling deactivated users from Google Workspace, you could use their command line tool or their API. So their command line tool is it's a official, unofficial tool. It's called GAM. It's very well documented. It's very powerful, but you could use that to pretty much do the same thing, and then just feed that into, use that to generate it, and use PowerShell or whatever other language to parse it, generate the CSV, and send out the email.
Great. We've got our next question. How can we give input of system serial number for this onboarding process?
I can grab this one. So we've actually gone through a couple different implementations of how we handle assigning systems to users. In our particular use case, the simple answer is that we put it in the CSV. So again, that input that I was talking about that we run through that script is a simple CSV file. You open it up in any Sheets processing software, put in that information, including the system serial number. In this case, we'll look through which physical systems we have in inventory and are set up and ready to go for users, even though they're not imaged yet, but they'll have the JumpCloud. It'll be a blank system with the JumpCloud agent running on it. So we'll just copy and paste that serial number into that field. And in the script, we'll automatically find that serial number in JumpCloud by querying that serial number, pulling the system ID in JumpCloud, and then assigning that user to that system ID, and then storing that system ID variable for any future policy changes or group assignments that are going to be needed for that system. Another tool that you could use, or another way you could handle that same process, is based on like available systems groups. For a while, we had a group of systems that every single time we image the system, we'd put it in that group so that you don't even need a serial number for new users. It'll just smartly pick one of those systems out based on the user's system, or based on the user's operating system preferences, and it'll just choose one of those systems at random. The downside to that, though, is that you don't really know which physical system is going to end up with that user's account on it. It'll only end up on a MacBook Pro or a MacBook Air, but if you have a stack of 20 MacBook Airs, and you have to figure out which one their account happened to get bound to, so that's not ideal, which is why we moved back to the manual serial number assignment.
And to add on to this quickly is that another thing that you could look at based on another form of automation that will feed into this is, when you hear people talk about zero-touch deployment and stuff like that, if you have some sort of MDM, whether it's JumpCloud, whether it's Intune, whether it's any of these other ones, you can completely take out that portion of it, because depending on the tool, they can go in, you could just send a system to a person, whether you're drop shipping it or just sending it from your inventory, and they'll have a workflow where they sign in to the system using the credentials generated by this onboarding script, and it automatically attaches that user to the system, and then does, some, depending on the MDM, it could do post-enrollment workflows and scripts and stuff like that. So that's another way of doing automation.
Great, thank you. All right, next question. How do you implement automation for tools that don't have a built-in automation framework?
So I will jump on this one, and it goes to API and scripting, but more importantly, this should be something that when you're looking at new tools, when you're assessing them, look at which ones may have built-in automation or workflow functions, and if that fails, which one gives you API access, and whether or not it is read and write access or just read access. I mean, there were some legacy tools that we don't really use anymore that didn't have any kind of automation workflows and only had read access to the API. So there really wasn't any way that we can automate that. And, that sometimes that's going to be the case. And that's something you just need to be aware of when you're selecting tools.
Great, all right. We might have a specific one here. I'm going to read this. Doesn't Windows 10 disable PowerShell scripts? If yes, do you have to re-enable it to use JumpCloud scripts on a Windows 10 PC?
So I can grab this super quick. So this script that we're talking about, this PowerShell script, is run on the IT member's computer. This isn't being run on each individual person's endpoint. And our tooling for like policies is applied through the JumpCloud agent, which is running on those systems, and it's not using PowerShell to implement those policies. So I actually don't know the specifics of, Brian might be able to answer this, of whether Windows 10 disables remote execution of PowerShell scripts, but this particular implementation is not being run on end user systems. All of this tooling is done on, for now, an IT team member system, but this could also be done in like an EC2 instance or something like that.
And yeah, I could jump in to answer some of this. So it's actually not something that I have run into with our Windows systems. Even so, for example, when we pushed out new endpoint protection and we were deploying it on Windows systems, we did it via a PowerShell script, a PowerShell command that was pushed out via the JumpCloud agent. So it was running PowerShell locally on the endpoint to install the system. And I didn't run into any problems with that, except for once the endpoint protection was installed, and if I accidentally ran the same command again, since I had it was pretty much putting some information, it was downloading files into the temp folder. It actually triggered detections on the endpoint protection saying, hey, this remote PowerShell command is being triggered out of the temp directory and stuff like that. So it may depending on exactly how you're doing it, it may trigger alerts based on your endpoint protection, that sort of thing. But as far as Windows 10 disabling PowerShell, I have not run into that being a problem at all, even on like fresh out of the box stock systems.
Great, thank you. We'll wrap up with one last question. I'll get you guys some information about next steps. But last question: does JumpCloud provide any support or help in creating commands or scripts that can be used on the platform?
So I'll answer this one as well. So there is a command gallery. There's also a GitHub repo specifically for the JumpCloud PowerShell module that is, I use it all the time as a refresher. And that will go through commands. It will give examples and everything like that. And also, here's a plug for our our JumpCloud Lounge Slack workspace, which is a community that has hundreds of JumpCloud admins. It's not just people from JumpCloud employees that go on there and share commands, share best practices. If you're trying to do something specific, you could go into the JumpCloud Lounge and go into the commands channel and say, hey, I'm trying to do this. Can you guys help? And people will pounce on it and be like, this is what we do, or try this. And it's a great resource.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Noah. That's great question to end on. Definitely check out the commands gallery. Definitely check out the JumpCloud Lounge. We'll be following up with slides and content that was shared here as a follow-up here and a leave behind, so you'll have access to this. But we'd like to thank you all for your time, and we look forward to seeing you on the lounge and wherever we meet you out on the interwebs and in life. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Please subscribe and check out more content from us.